I walked into that dining room at 6:40 p.m. on November 14th, and the first thing I felt was wrong. Not saw, felt. You know that animal instinct that kicks in when danger's near, when something's off even before your brain catches up. That's what hit me the second my foot crossed the threshold. The air was thick, suffocating, like everyone had sucked in a breath and forgotten to let it out. My wife Margaret was frozen by the china cabinet, her hand hovering over a serving spoon like she'd turned to stone mid-motion. My daughter Sarah had her eyes locked on her plate so hard I thought she might burn a hole through the porcelain. And then I saw him. My son David, 42 years old, wearing a smirk that could cut glass, sitting in my chair. Not just sitting, lounging. One arm draped over the back like he owned it. Legs spread wide in a posture that screamed ownership. His other hand scrolling through his phone like this was just another Tuesday at his office. My chair, the head of the table, the seat I'd occupied for 38 years in this house. My hands started shaking. I was holding Margaret's good serving platter, the one with the lamb I'd spent 4 hours preparing, and I felt my fingers go numb around the edges. The platter was hot, burning through the kitchen towel, but I barely felt it because something hotter was rising up my chest. Rage, humiliation, betrayal, all of it mixed together into something that tasted like copper in my mouth. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat like broken glass. And in that split second of silence, David finally looked up from his phone. Our eyes met, and he smiled. Not a son's smile. Not warm or apologetic or even embarrassed. It was the smile of a man who'd just won something. "Hey, Dad," he said, voice casual as Sunday morning coffee, grabbed the head seat. "Hope you don't mind. My back's been killing me, and this chair's got the better lumbar support. You understand, right?" The way he said it, like he was doing me a favor by explaining, like I should be grateful he even bothered to acknowledge my presence in my own goddamn house. I looked around the table, desperately searching for someone to say something. Anyone. My brother Frank was staring at his napkin like it held the secrets of the universe. His wife Linda suddenly became fascinated with the pattern on her water glass. Tom, my son-in-law, shifted uncomfortably but kept his mouth shut. Even little Emma, my 7-year-old granddaughter, seemed to sense something was horribly wrong, her eyes bouncing between me and her father like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. But the worst part, the part that drove a knife straight through whatever was left of my dignity, nobody objected. Not one single person at that table stood up for me. Not one voice said, "David, that's not right." Not one hand reached out to stop this family betrayal from unfolding right in front of everyone. They just sat there, complicit in their silence, letting my own son strip away everything I'd built in this family with one calculated move. That silence hurt more than any words he could have thrown at me. My chest tightened. For a second, I thought I might actually collapse right there, drop the platter, make a scene that would give them all something real to be uncomfortable about. My vision blurred at the edges. 68 years old, and I was standing in my own dining room feeling like a stranger, like some old relic they'd all decided to politely tolerate until I had the good sense to disappear. But then something clicked. Maybe it was the engineer in me, the part that understood structures and foundations and how things collapse when you remove the wrong support beam. Or maybe it was just pure, stubborn pride that refused to break in front of the man I'd raised. Either way, I made a decision in that moment. I wasn't going to fight him for that chair. Wasn't going to beg for respect or throw a tantrum like some powerless old man having a meltdown. No, I was going to do something he'd never expect. Something that would teach him a lesson about the difference between taking a seat and actually earning the right to sit in it. I smiled. A small, quiet smile that seemed to confuse everyone more than anger would have. I walked slowly to the opposite end of the table, the spot where David used to sit when he was 16 and thought he knew everything, and I sat down without saying a word. The confusion on their faces was almost worth the humiliation. Almost. David leaned back in my chair, practically glowing with satisfaction, thinking I'd just surrendered my place in this family without a fight. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't surrendered anything. I'd just changed the game, because my son didn't just take my seat that night. He took my place, my authority, the respect I'd earned through 4 decades of sacrifice, and everyone let it happen. But here's what David had forgotten in his arrogance, what his success and his money and his inflated ego had blinded him to. I built this family. I held the foundation. And when you're the one holding the foundation, you're also the one who decides when and how it all comes down. That night wasn't about food, it was about respect. And the moment I decided to stop asking for it and start taking it back, you need to understand something about me before this goes any further. My name's Richard. I'm 72 years old now. But when this happened, I was 68 and still had every bit of my mind intact. I wasn't some confused old man losing his grip on reality. I'd spent 37 years as a structural engineer, designing bridges, calculating load distributions, understanding exactly how much weight a foundation can bear before it cracks. I knew buildings, I knew structures, and I knew people. My whole life, I'd been the kind of man who showed up. Not the loudest guy in the room, not the one barking orders or demanding attention, but the one you could count on when everything else fell apart. When David was 9 and broke his arm falling off his bike, I was the one who stayed up all night in the hospital. When Sarah's first husband walked out on her, I was the one who helped her move, who sat with her while she cried, who reminded her she was worth more than some coward's abandonment. I wasn't perfect, but I was present. And that dining room table, that wasn't just wood and varnish. It was the spine of everything I'd built. Every Sunday for 38 years, we gathered there. That table saw everything: first communions, college acceptance letters, marriage proposals, arguments that nearly tore us apart, and reconciliations that stitched us back together. When Margaret got diagnosed with breast cancer in 2004, we sat around that table at 2 a.m., holding hands so tight our knuckles went white, praying like our lives depended on it because they did. When David's first business deal fell through and he lost everything at 26, we sat there and I helped him rebuild his confidence piece by piece. That seat at the head wasn't about power. It was about being the anchor when storms hit, about creating a space where my family could fall apart because they knew I'd help them find their pieces again. I never ruled with fear, never demanded blind obedience. I earned respect by being the kind of father my kids could lean on when the world got too heavy. That's why watching David take that seat felt like watching him set fire to a house I'd spent decades building with my bare hands. I wasn't one of those old-school tyrants who expected his kids to kiss his ring and bow down. Margaret and I raised our children to think for themselves, to question, to grow into strong, independent adults. And they did. David became a real estate developer, made his first million by 38, bought a house in the suburbs with more square footage than most people see in a lifetime. Sarah became a pediatrician, saved kids' lives, made me prouder than I could ever put into words. I celebrated their success, genuinely. Never felt threatened by it, never resented them for surpassing me financially or professionally. But somewhere along the way, maybe around the time David bought his 3rd investment property or closed that deal with the downtown developers, something shifted in him. Success does that sometimes. It convinces you that because you're winning in one area, you must understand everything better than everyone else. He started looking at me differently, not with respect or gratitude, with something that felt uncomfortably close to pity. The small disrespect started about 2 years before that dinner. Little things at first, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. He'd interrupt me mid-sentence to correct some minor detail that didn't matter. Actually, Dad, it was 2019, not 2018. Like the specific year changed the entire point of my story.
He'd offer unsolicited advice about how I should invest my retirement savings, which phone I should upgrade to, why I really needed to think about downsizing because maintenance gets harder at your age, Dad. Every conversation became an opportunity for him to demonstrate how much sharper he was, how much further ahead he was thinking.
And he'd deliver it all with this patronizing warmth, this smile that said he was doing me a favor by pointing out all the ways I was supposedly falling behind. When I'd push back, even gently, he'd sigh like I was a stubborn child refusing to take medicine that was good for me. "Dad, I'm just trying to help. You don't have to make this difficult." Like my dignity was an inconvenience he had to manage around. Then the family betrayal got bolder, more calculated. He started making decisions about family gatherings without asking me, moved Thanksgiving to his house 3 years running, changed Christmas dinner times to fit his schedule, invited extended family members to our gatherings like he was suddenly in charge of the guest list. When I'd question it, he'd hit me with that look, that tone dripping with false patience. "Come on, Dad, don't be difficult. Everyone's fine with it. You're the only one making this an issue." And the worst part, he was right. Nobody else pushed back. Margaret would stay quiet, caught between loyalty to her husband and love for her son. Sarah would play peacemaker, smoothing over tensions, begging me with her eyes to just let it go. My brother Frank would shrug like it wasn't worth the fight. Slowly, methodically, I watched my role in this family shrink from leader to consultant. Someone whose opinion was technically valued but ultimately optional. And that night, when David sat in my chair with that smug smile, when he looked me in the eye and dared me to object, I realized something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a power grab. It was a coronation. And everyone in this family had already accepted him as king. David wasn't always this way. That's what made it hurt so much. When he was a kid, he was the kind of boy who'd cry at sad movies, who'd save his allowance to buy his mother flowers on her birthday, who'd call me from college just to ask how I was doing. I remember when he was 14, he came to me at midnight, tears streaming down his face because he'd lied to me about where he'd been that evening. Turned out he'd gone to a party I'd said no to. He didn't have to confess. I never would have known. But guilt ate him alive until he told the truth and asked what his punishment should be. That's the son I raised. Honest, humble, kind. But somewhere between his first $1 million deal and his 5th investment property, that boy disappeared. Success has a funny way of rewriting people's memories, making them forget who they were before the money came, before the power, before everyone started telling them how brilliant they are. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, insidious, like watching a structure develop hairline cracks that slowly spread until suddenly you're staring at a collapse waiting to happen. It started about 3 years ago, right after he closed that downtown development deal, the one that put him on the cover of the regional business magazine. He showed up at Sunday dinner waving that magazine around like a trophy, and I was proud, genuinely proud. But then he started talking differently, using words like leverage and optimization and strategic positioning in casual conversation, like he was trying to remind everyone in the room that he operated on a different level now. When I'd share a story from my engineering days, he'd interrupt with, "Yeah, but that was a different era, Dad. The game's changed." Like my 37 years of experience had an expiration date, and he was politely informing me it had passed. Margaret would squeeze my hand under the table, silently begging me not to react. So I didn't. I bit my tongue and watched my son slowly edit me out of relevance. Then came the concerned son routine, which was somehow worse than outright disrespect because it was coated in this sickly sweet layer of fake care. He'd show up unannounced, walk through my house like he was conducting an inspection, and point out things that needed addressing. "Dad, you really should upgrade this wiring. It's a fire hazard at this age. Dad, these stairs are steep. Have you thought about what happens if you fall? Dad, you're still driving that old truck. The safety ratings on those are terrible. Let me help you find something more appropriate." Appropriate. Like I was a child who needed guidance picking out clothes for school. The worst was when he actually sat me down in my own living room, and suggested I should consider giving him power of attorney, just in case something happens. I was 66 years old, sharp as I'd ever been, and my son was already planning for my incapacity like it was inevitable and imminent. When I said no, he looked at me like I was being unreasonable, stubborn, difficult. I'm just trying to protect you, Dad. Why are you making this so hard? But the real shift, the moment I knew this family betrayal had crossed a line I couldn't ignore, happened about 6 months before that dinner. We were all gathered for Easter, and David stood up to make a speech. Started off thanking me and Margaret for everything we'd sacrificed, for giving him the foundation to succeed. Beautiful words. Everyone was smiling, dabbing at their eyes. Then he pivoted. But I think it's time we all acknowledge something. Dad's carried this family for long enough. He's earned his rest. From now on, let me and Sarah handle the heavy lifting. Let us take care of the decisions, the planning, the responsibility. You've done your part, Dad. It's our turn now. The table erupted in applause. Margaret teared up, thinking it was the sweetest thing she'd ever heard. Sarah nodded, grateful her brother was stepping up. But I heard what nobody else did. I heard the dismissal, the gentle shove toward irrelevance, the polite suggestion that my time was over and his had begun. He wasn't honoring me. He was retiring me, putting me out to pasture like an old horse that couldn't pull the weight anymore. And when I looked around that table and saw everyone nodding in agreement, saw them celebrating my demotion like it was some beautiful passing of the torch, I realized something that chilled me to my core. In their minds, I'd already stepped down. David wasn't staging a coup. He was just claiming territory they'd all already surrendered on my behalf. That dinner was supposed to celebrate Margaret's 65th birthday. We'd planned it for 3 weeks, coordinated everyone's schedules, made sure the whole family could be there, even Frank and his wife who lived 2 hours away. I'd spent the entire day cooking her favorite meal, slow-roasted lamb with rosemary and garlic, roasted root vegetables, homemade sourdough rolls that took me 2 days to perfect, and her mother's apple pie recipe that I'd finally mastered after years of trying. This was my love language, you know? Cooking for my wife, bringing everyone together, making sure every detail was right. David had called that morning around 10 a.m. "Hey, Dad, I'll swing by early to help set up. Maybe around 5:30? I'd thought it was thoughtful, maybe even a sign that we were getting back on track. But when he walked through that door at 5:40 p.m., I should have known. There was something in his walk, in the way he carried himself, like a man about to stake a claim. He didn't come to the kitchen, didn't ask what needed doing or how he could help. I heard his footsteps go straight to the dining room, heard chairs scraping against hardwood, heard him moving things around with purpose. When I walked in to see what he was doing, he was adjusting the place settings, rearranging the centerpiece Margaret had spent an hour perfecting, moving things to his preference like he owned the space. "Just making things flow better, Dad," he said without looking up. "Trust me, this layout's more efficient." Efficient, like we were optimizing a conference room instead of celebrating his mother's birthday. I opened my mouth to say something, but Margaret appeared in the doorway behind me, touching my elbow gently. "It's fine, Richard. Let him help." That's what she always said. Let him help. Let it go. Don't make waves. So I went back to the kitchen, jaw clenched so tight I thought I'd crack a tooth, and finished plating the lamb while my son redesigned my dining room like he was flipping one of his investment properties. By 6:30, everyone had arrived. Sarah and Tom came through the door with Emma, who ran to me first. "Grandpa, I drew you a picture," before being redirected by her father toward David, who was now positioned at the head of the table like a king holding court. Frank and Linda showed up carrying wine, stopped dead when they saw the seating arrangement, and Frank shot me a look that said everything his mouth didn't dare. Margaret's sister Joyce arrived last, took one glance at the table, and I watched her face go through confusion, understanding, and then careful neutrality in about 3 seconds flat. But nobody said anything, not one word. They just started filling in around David, adapting to this new order like it was natural, like this was how things had always been. I stood in the kitchen doorway with that platter of lamb, my hands shaking so hard I had to set it down on the counter before I dropped it. The smell of rosemary that I'd loved all day suddenly made me nauseous. When I finally walked into that dining room, David looked up from his phone and smiled. God, That smile. It wasn't apologetic or sheepish or even slightly uncomfortable. It was triumphant. "There he is," David announced to the room, voice loud and cheerful like he was hosting this dinner instead of me. "Dad," I grabbed the head seat. "Hope you don't mind. My lower back's been absolutely killing me lately. And honestly, this chair's got the best lumbar support in the house. You understand, right? I mean, at your age, you're probably more flexible about these things anyway." At your age. He said it like that, casual as talking about the weather. And the room went so silent I could hear Emma's crayon scratching paper 3 seats away. That silence hurt more than his words, because his excuse was insulting, transparent, almost calculated in its condescension, and yet nobody challenged it. Margaret's eyes went wide, but her mouth stayed shut. Sarah grabbed her water glass like it was a lifeline, suddenly very interested in the ice cubes. Tom stared at his napkin. Frank cleared his throat twice but said nothing. Even Joyce, who'd never been shy about calling out family betrayal in the past, just smoothed her napkin across her lap and avoided eye contact. I could have exploded. Every fiber in my body wanted to grab him by his expensive collar and throw him out of that chair, out of my house, out of my life. I could feel my pulse in my temples, my hands curling into fists at my sides, something hot and dangerous rising up my throat. But then I saw Emma watching me with those wide 7-year-old eyes, confused and scared, not understanding why Grandpa looked like he might break. And something clicked. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was strategy. Maybe it was just the bone-deep exhaustion of fighting a battle I was apparently meant to lose. Whatever it was, I made a choice. I smiled, small, controlled, deliberate, and walked to the opposite end of the table, David's old seat, the one where he'd sat as a cocky teenager who thought he knew everything. I pulled out the chair and sat down without saying a single word. The confusion on everyone's faces was almost comical. They'd braced for an explosion, for a confrontation, for me to either fight or crumble. But I gave them neither. And that uncertainty, that not knowing what was happening in my head, created a tension that hung over that table like smoke you couldn't wave away. You should have seen their faces when I didn't explode. Everyone at that table had braced for impact, for me to yell, to demand my seat back, to make some dramatic stand that would ruin Margaret's birthday and turn this into the kind of family blowout people talk about for years. But I didn't give them that. I just sat there at the far end, hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly through my nose like I was meditating instead of burning alive inside. Margaret kept glancing at me with this worried expression, like she was watching a bomb that hadn't decided whether to detonate yet. Sarah looked like she might cry, caught between relief that I wasn't causing a scene and guilt that she hadn't stopped one from being necessary. Even David seemed momentarily thrown. He'd positioned himself for a confrontation, armed with excuses and justifications, and I just accepted it, or at least, that's what he thought. His confusion lasted maybe 10 seconds before that smug smile crept back across his face. Wider now, more confident. He'd won, and I'd surrendered without a fight. That's what everyone thought. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking in that way they do now that I'm older, and walked toward the kitchen without saying a word. Behind me, I heard confused whispers. Margaret asking Sarah something in a hushed tone, Frank muttering to Linda, David's chair creaking as he leaned back even further, getting comfortable in his stolen throne. I pushed through the kitchen door and stood there for a moment, hands gripping the counter edge so hard my knuckles went white. My reflection stared back at me from the window over the sink, an old man, gray-haired, lines carved deep into his face from decades of smiling and worrying and holding things together. For just a second, I let myself feel it. The humiliation, the rage, the betrayal that tasted like acid in the back of my throat. Then I breathed, once, twice, 3 times, and I made my decision. Not revenge in the traditional sense, not revenge stories you hear about where someone loses their mind and burns everything down. No, this would be surgical, precise, A controlled demolition that would teach my son something his success had made him forget. Respect isn't taken. It's earned, and it can be taken away just as quietly. I loaded up the serving plates with mechanical precision, lamb sliced perfectly, vegetables arranged just so, rolls still warm from the oven. My hands were steady now, my mind clear. I walked back into that dining room carrying the first plate, and you could feel the tension shift immediately. Everyone stopped mid-conversation, watching me like I was a wild animal they couldn't predict. And then I did something that made the whole room go still. I walked straight to David and placed the first plate directly in front of him. "Here you go, son," I said, voice calm and even. "The best portions. You got the best seat. Might as well have the best food to go with it." His eyes flickered with something, surprise maybe, or suspicion. But then that arrogance kicked back in. "Thanks, Dad," he said, picking up his fork like a king accepting tribute. "This looks great. See? This is what I've been saying. You're at your best when you're not stressing about things that don't matter anymore." The room was so quiet you could hear Emma's breathing 3 seats away. I served everyone else methodically, saving my own plate for last, taking the smallest portions from what was left. Margaret reached for my hand when I finally sat down, squeezed it hard, her eyes asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. David raised his wine glass, my wine, from my cellar, poured into my crystal, and made a toast. "To Mom," he said, voice warm and commanding, "and to family, to new chapters and embracing change." "Dad, thanks for rolling with the punches tonight. Shows real character." He smiled at me across the length of that table, and I smiled back. A small, measured smile that seemed to confuse him for just a fraction of a second, before he shrugged it off and took a long drink. Everyone else followed suit, relieved that the crisis had apparently passed, that I'd accepted my new place in the family hierarchy without burning the house down. They had no idea what they were drinking to. No idea that while David thought he'd claimed his throne, he'd actually just walked into something he'd never see coming. Here's what David didn't know. What none of them sitting at that table understood while they watched me serve my own son like some butler in my own house. For the past 3 years, while David was busy building his real estate empire and measuring himself for the crown he thought he deserved, I'd been doing something he'd never expect from old-fashioned dad who doesn't understand modern finance. I'd been restructuring everything. See, when you spend 37 years as a structural engineer, you learn something crucial. Before you demolish anything, you need to understand exactly what's holding it up. And I'd spent decades holding up this family, not just emotionally, but financially in ways David had either forgotten or never bothered to learn. That house he thought was just Mom and Dad's old place, paid off, in my name alone, worth $1.2 million in the current market. The vacation cabin in the mountains where we'd spent every summer since the kids were little, mine. The investment accounts I'd quietly built while working those long hours he used to complain about me missing his soccer games for, all mine. And the family trust I'd established 20 years ago, the one that held the real assets, the one David assumed he'd inherit automatically because he was the successful son. Well, that had some very specific conditions attached. I'd met with my attorney, Jim Peterson, 4 times in the past 8 months. Good man, Jim. We'd gone to high school together, built our careers side by side, and he understood exactly what I was dealing with because he'd watched his own daughter pull similar stunts with his wife before she passed. "Richard," he'd told me during our first meeting, "you've got every right to structure this however you want. It's your assets, your legacy. And if David's treating you like you're incompetent, maybe it's time he learned exactly how competent you still are." So we'd worked through it, page by page, clause by clause, revised the trust documents, updated the will, added performance requirements and respect clauses that made it crystal clear. Inheritance wasn't a birthright in this family. It was earned through character, not just chromosomes. And sitting there at the far end of my own table, watching David cut into that lamb like he owned the place, I knew he had absolutely no idea what he'd just triggered by taking my seat. I wanted him comfortable, arrogant, certain he'd won. Because that's when people reveal who they really are. Not when they're fighting for something, but when they think they've already got it locked down. So I kept serving, kept smiling, kept playing the role of the gentle old man who'd finally accepted his diminished place in the family order. I brought out Margaret's birthday cake, 3 layers, chocolate with raspberry filling, her absolute favorite, and I made sure David got the first slice. The biggest piece for the man of the house, I said, and I watched his chest puff up just a little, watched him accept that title like it had always been his destiny. Margaret squeezed my hand under the table again, harder this time, and I could feel her confusion radiating off her in waves. Sarah looked like she might be sick, pushing food around her plate without eating. But David, he was glowing. Holding court, telling stories about his latest development deal, explaining market trends to Frank like he was teaching a child arithmetic, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting in a chair that was about to be pulled out from under him. The table had become a stage, and everyone was playing their part without knowing they were in a show. David was the king who didn't realize his crown was cardboard. Margaret was the queen caught between loyalty and fear. Sarah was the princess trying to hold a crumbling kingdom together with good intentions. And me, I was the architect who'd built the whole structure and knew exactly which support beam to remove to bring it all down. Not violently, not dramatically, just inevitably. Because here's what my son had forgotten in all his success and arrogance and family betrayal. I didn't just build this family. I built the foundation it stood on. And when you control the foundation, you control everything. That night, serving him first, watching him accept my deference as his due, I wasn't surrendering. I was loading the demolition charges. And very soon, everyone at that table was going to understand the difference between occupying a seat and actually earning the right to sit in it. We were halfway through dessert when I stood up. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a slow, deliberate rise from my chair that somehow made everyone stop mid-conversation and look at me. Before we finish celebrating Margaret's birthday, I said, voice calm and clear, there's something I need to share with the family, something important that I've been working on for the past few months. I walked to the sideboard where I'd placed my leather document folder earlier that evening, the one David had probably noticed and dismissed as just more of Dad's old paperwork. I pulled out a manila envelope, held it for a moment, feeling its weight. Margaret's face went pale. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. David leaned back in my chair. His chair now, he thought, with this amused, patronizing expression like he was indulging a confused old man who probably wanted to share outdated insurance information or something equally irrelevant. Dad, can this wait? He said, glancing at his watch. Some of us have early meetings tomorrow. Some of us, like his time was more valuable than this moment, like he was doing me a favor by still being here. No, David. It can't wait. I opened the envelope and pulled out the documents, official, notarized, legally binding pages that had cost me $800 to $500 in attorney fees and 8 months of careful planning. 3 weeks ago, I finalized some changes to the family trust and my will, changes I felt were necessary given some recent shifts in family dynamics. I let that word hang there, shifts, and watched David's expression change from amused to alert. I see. This family has assets some of you might not be fully aware of. This house, worth $1.2 million, fully paid off. The mountain cabin, worth $450,000. Investment accounts totaling just over $890,000. The family trust, which holds another $1.4 million in various holdings. All of it built over 40 years of work, sacrifice, and careful planning. I could see David doing the math in his head, his eyes widening slightly. He'd always assumed there was family money, but I don't think he'd ever added it all up. Never thought it mattered because he'd assumed it would all be his someday anyway. Now, the original trust documents split everything between you and Sarah equally upon my and your mother's passing, 50-50, fair and simple. I pulled out the revised trust document, the new one, and set it on the table between us. But here's what you need to understand, David. This trust has always had conditions attached. Conditions about family values, about respect, about character. And it includes a clause that allows me to modify distributions based on conduct that violates those values. The room was so silent, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. So I've made some changes. As of 3 weeks ago, your distribution has been reduced from 50% to 15%. Sarah's has increased to 70%. The remaining 15% goes to establish a college fund for Emma and any future grandchildren. David's face went from confused to white to red in about 5 seconds. The assets in my name alone, this house, the cabin, the accounts, those now pass entirely to your mother, with Sarah as secondary beneficiary. You get nothing from those unless you meet very specific requirements over the next 5 years. I pulled out another sheet, and those requirements include demonstrated respect for both parents, regular family participation without attempts to control or manipulate, and a formal apology, written and verbal, for tonight's behavior and the pattern of disrespect that led to it. What the hell are you talking about? David's voice cracked. All that smooth confidence shattered like glass hitting concrete. He stood up so fast the chair, my chair, nearly tipped backward. You can't do this. You can't just... I absolutely can, David. I did. It's legal. It's filed. And it's done. I stayed calm. Didn't raise my voice even a decibel. You thought taking my seat tonight made you the head of this family. You thought your money and your success meant you could treat me like I'm some confused old man who doesn't understand how the world works anymore. Well, here's a lesson in understanding. I built everything you're standing on. This house, this family. The foundation you thought you could just claim, because you decided it was your turn. The whole table was frozen. Margaret with her hand over her mouth. Sarah crying silently. Frank staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Little Emma confused and scared. You don't inherit respect, son. You earn it, and you don't take someone's place just because you think you're ready for it. You wait until it's offered, and you accept it with gratitude, not arrogance. David's hands were shaking, his face contorted with rage and humiliation, and something that might have been fear. I didn't take your seat to humiliate you, Dad. You took it to prove something, David. To yourself, to me, to everyone here. And you know what? You did prove something. You proved exactly why these changes were necessary. The silence that followed was absolute. Suffocating. The kind of quiet that happens when a truth so devastating gets spoken that nobody knows how to respond. I didn't take his seat back. Didn't need to. Because in that moment, everyone at that table understood something. I'd never lost my place. I'd just been waiting for my son to reveal whether he deserved his. Let me tell you something I learned that night. Something I wish I'd understood years earlier before it got this far. As parents, we're not supposed to compete with our children. We're supposed to celebrate their success, support their growth, help them become better versions of themselves than we ever were. But here's the other side of that coin that nobody talks about. We're also not supposed to erase ourselves in the process. We're not supposed to shrink and fade and apologize for still existing just because our kids have surpassed us in some areas. There's a difference between stepping back gracefully and being shoved aside. There's a difference between sharing authority and having it stripped from you while everyone watches in uncomfortable silence. That night wasn't about me clinging to power or refusing to let go. It was about my son confusing my patience with weakness, my kindness with surrender, my love with permission to disrespect everything I'd built. And the lesson he learned, the one I should have taught him years ago, is that respect isn't something you take. It's something you lose. And once it's gone, no amount of money or success or confidence can buy it back. David left that dinner without saying another word, grabbed his coat, his wife, his daughter, and walked out into the November cold while the rest of the family sat in stunned silence around that table. Margaret cried, not because she disagreed with what I'd done, but because she'd watched our family fracture in a way that couldn't be easily repaired. Sarah stayed behind, helped clean up, and told me through tears that she'd seen it coming, that she'd wanted to say something for months but didn't know how. "He forgot who you are, Dad," she whispered, while washing dishes at 11 p.m. "He forgot that just because you don't shout doesn't mean you don't have power." And she was right. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention or throw tantrums or need constant validation. Real power is knowing your worth, understanding your value, and refusing to accept anything less than the respect you've earned. I didn't take my seat back that night because I didn't need to. I'd never actually lost it. I'd just been waiting to see if my son was man enough to recognize that on his own. He wasn't. So I reminded him, not with violence or cruelty, but with truth. With the reality that every structure, family included, has a foundation, and you don't build anything lasting by tearing that foundation down. If you've made it this far, if this story hits something deep in your chest, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button if you've ever been disrespected by someone you raised, someone you sacrificed for, someone who should have known better. Subscribe to this channel if you want more revenge stories like this. Not violent, not cruel, just real accounts of people who decided their dignity was worth fighting for, even when everyone else told them to let it go. And here's my question for you, the one I want you to answer in the comments. Have you ever stayed quiet to protect your dignity, only to have someone mistake that silence for weakness? Tell me your story. Because here's what I know for certain after 72 years on this earth, after raising 2 kids and building a life and learning some lessons the hard way, if someone only respects you when you're loud, when you're aggressive, when you're demanding attention like a child throwing a fit, then they never respected you at all. Real respect recognizes quiet strength. Real respect honors patience. Real respect understands that the person who built everything you're standing on deserves more than being pushed aside when they're no longer convenient. My son learned that lesson the hard way. I just hope he learned it in time,